The paper-covered single-section pamphlet is the perfect first bookbinding project. It introduces bookbinding skills such as measuring, cutting, folding and sewing, and the important paper property of grain direction. It uses basic tools that most people will have already and doesn't require adhesive. It leads nicely into a hardcover pamphlet binding as the next step in your bookbinding journey. The pamphlet binding has been around for hundreds of years and will never go out of date. It remains a practical and aesthetically pleasing simple binding. The idea of using the paper-covered pamphlet binding as a first bookbinding project came from the book Bookforms. The details are in the description. The tools you'll need are a steel ruler, a craft knife, a bone folder, a pencil, a plastic square, an awl, some bulldog clips, a needle and thread, scissors, and some corrugated cardboard. The materials you'll need is some short grain A6 or half US letter size paper and the same size decorative paper for the cover. Machine-made paper has a property called grain direction. For this video, I'm just going to say it's the direction that paper folds easiest. But it's far more interesting than this, and after making a few of these books, I'd recommend watching my video on paper grain. Luckily for us, most A4 and US letter copy paper is long grain, and once cut in two is short grain, just what we want for this project. Use between 6 and 8 sheets of copier paper for this little booklet. I'm using 6 because it's slightly heavier paper. Fold them to form a section or signature. You should always fold them together and not separately. Folding them individually will mean that they won't nest inside of each other well. There's a little trick to distributing the creep between the front and the back of the book. Lift it up and pinch it with your fingers and then drop it down, which fans out the pages slightly. Now fold the sheets over and crease at the spine outwards from the center. By creasing the spine fold outwards from the center, any stretch that occurs is distributed in each direction. If you happen to have a book press, it's a good idea to give the section a really solid nip now. Overnight would be fantastic. If you don't have a press, then just put it under some weight, like a brick or some heavy books. This presses the air out of the section or signature and makes it look neater. It's an optional step, you don't have to do it. Now we'll fold the cover paper around the section. Ideally the cover paper is a little bit heavier than the text paper, but it doesn't have to be. If you can cut the cover paper so it's a bit longer so that it fits all the way around with the extra thickness of the section, that's perfect. And then we'll use the bulldog clips to hold everything in place. The simplest version of the pamphlet sewing involves 3 holes. So we'll make a little template with a scrap piece of paper. So we'll mark the head and tail of the book on the template and then put a mark in 12 millimeters or a half an inch from each end and a mark in the center. Using this template, we'll punch holes through the fold of the section. So we'll put the template in place and then using an awl, we'll push holes through the section at 45 degrees. I'll demonstrate an improved version of this template on the second book. Some people like to use a thing called a punching cradle, but I'm not a big fan of those. Bookbinders use a little trick to stop the needle coming off the thread. You pierce the thread with the needle and then pull the thread back over the eye. I'm going to use a thin linen thread, but you can use any type of thread for this book. If you're using cotton or a nylon thread, just use a double length of it. For this book, I'm going to put the knot on the outside. So starting on the outside, I go in the center hole, go down to one end, come back out to the outside, skip the center down to the other end, back to the center, and then back out through the center hole. The important thing is to have one thread either side of the thread that goes from head to tail, and then we'll tie a knot over the top. So we'll just tie a reef knot or a square knot, left over right, then right over left, and then cut off the tails so they're nice and short. For the second book, we'll start on the inside, and then the knot will finish on the inside. And for extra style marks, you can fray out the little tails of the knot. The first time I saw that was in a Dove's Press book, and it looked like a little moth had been squashed inside the book. The book can be finished at this point, but I'm going to go on and do the optional step of trimming the edges to make it look nice and neat. I'm going to use my bench hook to do this. You don't need a bench hook. You just need something to be able to push a square and a ruler up against. So I'll cut the ends of the book off square using a very sharp craft knife. To trim the foredge, I'll measure in from the spine the same distance at the head and tail. I'll make little marks with the knife. This technique of measuring in from an edge and then making a mark with a knife up against the end of a ruler is a very good way of making precision cuts. That's the first pamphlet complete. The second one we'll do is larger. It's going to be twice as large, and because it's larger, we'll do a 5-hole sewing pattern instead of a 3, and we'll use a fancier hole punching jig, and we'll put the knot on the inside. I'm going to use a really nice paper called Mohawk Superfine, A4 short grain. In the US, you can buy this paper in letter size short grain from Hollanders, and in Australia I sell it by the ream. Fold the same as before, creasing out from the center so that the stretch is distributed in both directions, and then fold the cover paper around the outside. This is one of my own paste papers. I'll put a link in the description to the video on how to make paste papers, and then use bulldog clips to hold it all together. Now I'll make the fancier punching jig. So just a piece of manila card with a notch at one end. I'll mark the tail and then put the other marks in 12 millimeters or half an inch from the head and tail, and then divide the distance between those by 4 so that there's 5 sewing holes. Same deal, I'm just going to use a different awl for this one. Punch into the fold at 45 degrees into some corrugated cardboard. What's nice about this little jig is that you can hook it over the head of the section, and it aligns all the sheets to the head, and using a piece of manila card or a card you can push it into the fold, which pushes all the sheets into the fold of the section. This time I want the knot in the center, so I'll start in the center, going out through the center hole, then back in to the next hole, and then down to the end, back to the outside. Then back through the second hole, skip the center, the next hole, back in at the end, back out on the second hole, and then finally back in through the center. And just like before, we want a thread either side of the thread that goes from head to tail. And then we tie the knot down over that thread, which holds it in place. Same square knot or reef knot, left over right, right over left, and then trim off the tails. That could be the book done, but I'm going to go on and do the optional step of trimming the edges. It just makes it a little bit neater. I nearly always use the 5-hole pamphlet stitch, even for smaller books. And if I went for a book that was twice this size, A4, I'd do a 7-hole pamphlet stitch. The third and final method for today is to make a pamphlet like in the first 2 examples today, except with the plain cover. It can have the knot on the inside or the outside, it's your choice. And then we'll make a wraparound cover for it. I'm going to put the knot on the outside and do the 5-hole variation for the sewing. The nice little feature that really makes this cover is the square back at the spine. The piece of decorative paper for the cover needs to be the same height as the book and 4 times the width. The first thing we're going to do is to measure the thickness of the book. To do that, we'll use a scrap piece of paper. We'll just fold it, and then we'll place it where the thickest part of the book is, which is just inside the spine. And then we'll fold that scrap over the top edge of the book, and that will give us the thickness of the book. I'll just mark those creases with the pencil so that I can see them easier. I'll fold the cover paper in half, and then I'll mark the width of the spine from the scrap piece of paper. I'll use the ruler and the bone folder to make the second fold. I'll start by creasing a line along the pencil marks, then lift the paper up, and then bone it up against the ruler, and then finally fold it over. That produces a nice, crisp, square spine. Place the book back into the cover, pushing it back into the spine, and then make a mark about 1 millimeter away from the foredge of the book. And that's where we're going to fold the paper. We'll use the scrap piece of paper to transfer that mark to the head and tail of the book and to the other side of the book. We want the same measurement at the front and the back. We'll fold the flaps the same way as we folded the spine. So we'll use the ruler to crease a line along the marks and then crisp that fold up against the ruler and then complete the fold. The flaps are going to be slightly too wide to close, so we'll trim off 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. So we'll just mark in 6 millimeters on the scrap piece of paper, transfer those measurements to the flaps, and then cut them off. That's the introduction to the paper-covered pamphlet finished. I'll continue the series by doing a video on a couple of fancier versions, one with a turn-in and another where the pamphlet fits inside pockets of the cover. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you are able and want to, you can support me through Patreon or with a one-off contribution, and the details are in the description below. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button and select the notification bell. Until next time, cheerio!